When Hammurabi came to rule Babylon around 1792 BC, the throne of Babylon didn't confer one authority over an empire. And for most of Hammurabi's reign, things remained much the same. But around 30 years into his rule, the Elamites of the east invaded. After successfully repelling the Elamites, Hammurabi determined to do some invading of his own. He conquered Larsa before turning to the north and conquering land up to and including Mari, thus building the largest empire to grace Mesopotamia ever since the time of Akkadian dominance. Having established an empire, Hammurabi promulgated what he is most famous for, his law code. Though not the first law code known, with a number of preceding codes starting with that of either Ornama or Shulgi of the Ur-3 dynasty hundreds of years prior, Hammurabi's law code is far more fleshed out than Ornama's, with its 282 laws a more than tenfold increase in the amount of laws when compared to the prior law codes of Ornama as well as that of Lipit Ishtar, and a more than fourfold increase from the more recent 60 laws of Ashnina that remain. But beyond Hammurabi's reign and his laws, much of the rest of the history of the Old Babylonian Empire is that of decline. Hammurabi's son and successor, Samsu-iluna, saw numerous rebellions during his reign and lost much of the empire, though Mari seems to have remained in Babylonian hands. Samsu-iluna's reign is also the first we get wind of a group called the Kassites, who will figure importantly later on as rulers of Babylonia, and he describes himself as having beaten them in the name he gives to the 9th year of his reign, year in which Samsu-iluna the king defeated the totality of the strength of the army, the troops of the Kassites. The dynasty started by Hammurabi would live on, though not ruling much of the territory it once did, until around 1595 BC when it found itself under the great-great-grandson of Hammurabi, Samsu-ditana. At that time, from the north stormed the Hittites under their king Mursili I. The Hittites didn't come for land, and instead raided, with death and destruction in their wake. They left the defeated Babylon and fragmented rule behind, taking with them captives, riches, and statues of Babylon's divine couple, the great Marduk and his consort Sarpanit. With the defeat of Babylon by the Hittites, we enter a dark age of Mesopotamian history from which few cuneiform records reach us. But before 100 years would pass, two new powers had arisen, and they, along with the Hittites, were the three major players in the Near East. They are, 1. The Kassites of Babylonia. The Kassites would go on to provide the longest dynasty over Babylon in Mesopotamian history. And for much of this period, their primary military occupation were the Elamites to their east, rather than their northern counterparts. In the peak of their power, in the early 14th century BC, Kassite king Kurigalzu I went out against the Elamites and sacked their capital city of Susa. Meanwhile, players 2 and 3 could be found in the north, where there were two major powers alongside one another. The prior conqueror of Babylon Hittites, who ruled in Turkey, and the Mittani Empire of Syria to the south of the Hittites. The Mittani would grow to an extent at the expense of the Hittites and peak in power in the early 14th century BC. Around 1350, the recently autonomous of the Mittani Empire kingdom of Ashur saw Ashur-uballit bite off a chunk of Mittani territory, building Assyria into a significant power in the east. Before Assyria would go through their pre-Late Bronze Age collapse, rise, around 1500 BC, Egypt entered into the picture by storming up the coast and battling the Mittani, and while the initial interactions between Egypt and the Near East were rather impolite, diplomatic relationships developed and fructified, with treaties arising and messengers bearing messages and gifts and requests for gifts traveled from Egypt's court to the courts of the Near Eastern powers. The same flowed from the Near Eastern rulers to the pharaoh, with the addition of the occasional sending of a daughter of the ruler to marry the pharaoh. Pharaohs preferred it this way and demanded that they needn't send their daughters out of Egypt to marry the pharaoh's new quote-unquote brothers, as the kings referred to each other. For the Kassites and the Hittites, their story would last to the Late Bronze Age collapse, and Egypt would weather the early storm, leaving behind compelling reports of the chaos underway. But for Mittani, their story ends earlier still. The relationship between Mittani and the Hittites was often fraught. The Hittite king Supi-Luliuma launched a semi-successful campaign against the Mittani king Tushratta, but he couldn't take the capital. But Supuli-Uli-Uma wouldn't have to wait long for the perfect opportunity to land in his lap. King Tushratta was murdered by one of his own sons, and another son reached out to King Supili-Uli-Uma for help usurping the claimant to the throne who wasn't the murderous son but a relative. Supili-Uli-Uma helped out while the Assyrians opposed, supporting an alternative, but Supili-Uli-Uma won out, and now established on the throne of Mittani was his vassal king Shatiwaza, who started reigning around 1330 BC. But even the province of Mittani, within the larger Hittite Empire, now only comprised of its western half, with the kingdom of Ashur having previously taken advantage of Mittanian weakness and come to control the eastern half. A later Assyrian king who came to the throne around 1265 BC, Shalmaneser I, managed to wrest the Mittani kingdom proper from the Mittani king and his Hittite allies. The Hittite king Supili-Uli-Uma may have gone down as a far more famous player in history if he'd had success with another seemingly golden opportunity that landed on his lap. While earlier in his reign he'd taken advantage of Pharaoh Akhenaten's disinterest in running his empire by taking control of Egyptian territory in Syria, by now an Egyptian widow queen reached out asking for one of his sons in marriage to become the pharaoh. Supili-Uli-Uma sent the son, who was murdered on the way, and relations between Hatti and Egypt chilled, starting with Supili-Uli-Uma sending accusatory letters to the new pharaoh Ai, sending troops into Egyptian-controlled land in Canaan, and unfortunately for him, bringing back plague for his people. Hittite-Egyptian tensions peaked later on at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, and 16 years later the two powers made a treaty. Ashur, the Hittites, the Kassites, and Egypt were what remained as the Late Bronze Age entered chaos. By around 1180 BC, the Hittites had collapsed, and its capital saw the temples and citadel destroyed. The great power of Assyria grew by gnawing on the fresh carcass of the Hittites, before Assyria itself shriveled up as the coming millennium loomed until they found themselves limited to the city of Ashur and its environs. By around 1155 BC, Kassite Babylonia was successfully invaded by the Elamites, and once again the statue of Marduk was taken from his home. Egypt had been invaded in the early 12th century BC with Ramses III in power, and they successfully fended off the invading Sea Peoples, but the battles weakened Egypt, and Ramses III is considered the last New Kingdom pharaoh to wield substantial control over Egypt, and a weary and beleaguered Egypt finally descended into the slumber of the Third Intermediate Period around 1077 BC. One of the sources of chaos in this period of collapse came from the sea heading from north to south. We know of these so-called Sea Peoples seemingly making their way south, defeating Gugarit and Al-Ashia, and finally reaching their match at Egypt's door and being turned back. Some of them settled nearby, most famously the Philistines, identified as one of the invading Sea Peoples of Egypt, the Paliset. But the chaos these people were bringing about near the coast seems unrelated to the chaos ensuing inland, such as for the Hittites and the Elamite invasion of the Kassites. With the 1155 collapse of the Kassites, we enter into another dark age from which the Assyrians would be so kind as to awaken us out of and into the largest empire to have as yet ever existed. As for the Assyrians themselves now, they were only marginally affected early on as the Hittites, the Kassites, and others fell, though the Assyrians did decline some before starting a second period of ascendancy around 1100 BC under TIGLATH PILESER I. A number of 11th century tablets bearing Middle Assyrian laws were found in the city of Ashur, and the only tablet whose date formula is preserved is under the reign of TIGLATH-Pileser. Middle Assyrian laws come from some other sources as well, and these laws cover many things, including homicide, theft, sexual offenses, debts, along with many other areas. Some of these laws seem to take the logic of an eye for an eye to an extreme, including laws that demanded as part of the punishment for a man raping another man's daughter, for the punishment to include the raping of the guilty man's daughter. And part of the punishment for one who sodomized the comrade, quote, "They shall sodomize him, and they shall turn him into a eunuch." TIGLATH-Pileser also compiled the so-called palace decrees of a number of kings, partial remains from 9 of which have survived for us to read. These decrees were for regulating palace personnel with particular concern for the king's harem. To take a couple of examples, if a palace woman and a man are standing by themselves with no third person with them, whether they are behaving in a flirtatious manner or in a serious manner, they shall kill them. Or, quote, if a court attendant wishes to speak with a palace woman, he shall approach no closer to her than 7 paces, unquote. Despite Assyria's resurrected late Bronze Age ascendancy, the vacuum of power left behind with the disappearance of the other major players had various other peoples making their ways about. One such people were the Aramaeans, who as early as TIGLATH PILESER's reign were raiding deep into Assyrian territory. TIGLATH PILESER's successors were generally further on the defensive, and as we saw, 1000 BC passed with them only reigning over their heartland. Soon enough, however, the people of Ashur, most importantly the king of Ashur, in the service of the namesake of his city, who he served as high priest of, turned outward. Neo-Assyria, arise.